Hey everyone, welcome to another great edition of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe. We have a very unique setting for College Game Day this week. It is going to be in Durham, North Carolina, at the home of Duke University. And Joe, no, this is not College Game Day for basketball. This is College Game Day for football, and this will be the first time that they have ever come to the Dukies for College Game Day. What an incredible achievement! And Coach Mike Elko's only his second season at Duke.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the best coaching jobs I've ever seen in the modern era of college football. What he's done with the level of expectation coming into last season, and right now they're right there in the thick of things in the ACC, and they've got a marquee matchup now against Notre Dame.
Absolutely, Joe. I mean, I think what Coach Prime has done at Colorado is incredible, but we may ultimately be looking at a first season that ends in Colorado with a much less impressive win-loss record than what we saw with Duke. And it might be impossible almost for Coach Prime to replicate the kind of success that Mike Elko has been able to have in his first two seasons at Duke. When we look at a season right now where it seems like a double-digit wins is not out of the question at all.
Not at all. I mean, I think that they have a chance to finish second in the ACC.
Absolutely, Joe. And every week they've looked impressive. I mean, from drubbing Clemson 28-7 at home and having just one of the best field stormings I've ever seen. To last week they went out and I can't remember trying to think it was they beat. I remember I took them on the points and they did excellent. They won 41-7 over a middling program and did very good. And every week they've gone out and just looked really strong over and over again. And they've got an excellent defense, a really solid quarterback in Riley Leonard from Fairhope, Alabama. So shout out there. Who in a year where we didn't have this many great quarterbacks could be a first-round draft pick. He may still be, but I just think that there's so many other quarterbacks this year he may get lost in the maelstrom. If he can wait another year, that might be a good decision for him. They're just an excellent football team. And now they get to host a reeling Notre Dame, a Notre Dame who just had a soul-crushing game, one where they laid it all on the line. They played really great football for basically 59 minutes and 30 seconds and ultimately came down short, a lot of which I think because of Marcus Freeman's inexperience coach. I think that they would have won that game with Brian Kelly. I mean, I think they would have won that game with a more experienced head coach and one who would trust in the ability to let their 24-year-old quarterback, who's the all-time leading passer in the history of ACC, who I think is going to be just an absolute stud at the NFL, they didn't let him have the chance to win the game. And now they're going to have to recover and take on a Duke team that has a defense that's probably better than Ohio State's defense. That's going to be at a home environment where Duke is getting to host its first ever game day. And this is a rough spot for the Irish.
Yeah, it's really rough, Dan, because it comes at a horrible time coming off that loss. This is the type of weekend where if you're Notre Dame, you would much prefer having like an FCS opponent or a smaller college coming into town just to kind of have an off week. It's really this horrible schedule the way this has worked out for them. And so I think this is a very losable game if you're Notre Dame and you could be out of the national title hunt, 5 weeks, 6 weeks into the season.
Joe, I'm really very worried at Marcus Freeman's ability to be able to win a big game like this when there's a relatively even level of talent on the field, or at least in the way they're playing. We didn't see him do it at all last year in any game that was big. His first huge opportunity there, he did a great job getting the players prepared, but in game, he had some crucial flaws, including calling a timeout at the end of the 1 yard line and having 2 plays in a row with 10 men on the field, not going forward on 3rd and 15 and throwing the ball when you have Sam Hartman. And we went through all these in our last episode, but I would much rather have Mike Elko as my head coach right now, and I would not be worried about him making a mistake at the end of the game.
Yeah, I mean, you have less concern about him. I mean, his track record, what he's done, almost in 2 seasons or a year and a half. I mean, it's just unbelievable, like we were talking about.
Yeah, so Joe, I'm not quite making it my lock of the week, but I do like Duke to win this game at home. And it's not just because Notre Dame waltzed the game last week. I think if it had been a game where they won in a similar way, like in a goal line stand or scoring from 1 yard out with like 10 seconds left. I may still want to take Duke in this because I just think that Duke is catching Notre Dame at such a great time. And I mean, we saw, a few weeks ago when they opened the season with Clemson, it's not a big stadium, but the Duke fans get after it. They made it into a good home environment.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you look at the fact that this is a tough game for Notre Dame. I was pulling up their schedule the rest of the way. They've got, 7 games left. I mean, because, they don't play in a conference, like there's a lot of tricky games the rest of the schedule, a lot of weird games where this could kind of go in the wrong direction. You got Louisville the very next week on the road. Then you host USC on October 14th. Then you're hosting Pittsburgh, very winnable game there. But then you've got to play at Clemson. That's a weird game. And then Sam Hartman's going to have an emotional game for him hosting Wake Forest on November 18th. And then you finished at Stanford. And so my point is, if this goes the wrong direction, a season that really, should have resulted in probably a college football playoff appearance, bringing in Hartman. I mean, that was the expectation. You easily could end up as like a 9-3, 8-4 team.
Oh, Joe definitely has that ability right now. I mean, with what has happened with them lately, losing this game and what they have sitting ahead of them, just not a good place. I was trying to figure out who it was that Duke beat up on last week, and it was UConn. They beat them 41-7. UConn's not a good football team by any metric, but still, I mean, I think they were on the road when they did that too. That's what you do against the teams that are not that great. You take care of business. And so I've just been really excited with not only the way Duke is winning, but the way they're actually getting the W's. Like they're doing it like a dominant team is supposed to. And I mean, we saw that as good as Sam Hartman is when he plays a good defense, which Ohio State's got a good defense. I mean, Jim Knowles, one of the best DCs in America. They don't put up a lot of points, and I just don't see them scoring a lot of points against this Duke defense. And I like the home crowd. I like their ability to play defense. I like their steady quarterback play from Riley Leonard to push Duke through to the upset this weekend.
Yeah, I think, Dan, the more I think about it, I think that's probably what's going to happen. I mean, I can see a path where Hartman, wills Notre Dame to victory, but I just think it's just the worst time, like we were talking about. It's the worst time ever for this game to happen if you're Notre Dame. And I don't see the way that game ended last Saturday night. I don't see how a team comes back from that in 1 week.
Absolutely. Joe, road games makes me think of my lock of the week. They haven't had the best season this year. They really kind of topped out last season, but it's always been a consistent program. Ever since I was a little kid when they played D2 football, at that time they were Troy State. Now, of course, they're the Troy Trojans. Has always been a force in southeastern central Alabama because that's the only thing that is in southeastern central Alabama. They played excellent football. Ever since they moved to the D1 level, they've just done it with defense, and they're always so tough to beat. And since they joined the Sun Belt, they've been probably the best team in the Sun Belt, I think, the last 4 or 5 seasons. And Joe, I saw a very rare sight when I was looking at the daily lines today. I saw that Troy was an underdog in a Sun Belt conference game against Georgia State. Georgia State's a newer team in the Sun Belt. They've got off to a hot start. They're 4-0. They beat Coastal Carolina last week, which, I mean, Coastal Carolina comes with a lot of cachet based on what they've done the last 2 years. But they've taken some steps back the last year and a half, and I don't think that game is as much as it has been. Troy's underperformed a little bit. They didn't play very good against Kansas State when they had the chance. They lost to James Madison in a really tight game. But that Troy defense is still bad, man. They still got a lot of good NFL players on that defense. I think that, taking a road trip in a game against a team that's very full of themselves, I think that the defense of the Troy Trojans gets it done, and they pull the slightest upset as a very rare road underdog in Sun Belt play against Georgia State. So I like the Troy Trojans on the money line.
When coming into the season, you wouldn't have expected them to even be an underdog in that game. You would have thought they would have a chance to maybe even go like 11-1 with this season.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought Troy was a good. I think Troy and South Alabama and Tulane were 3 teams that I all thought had a chance to be the Group of 5 representative in the New Year's Six. I think that Tulane's the only one out of them that still has that opportunity. But all 3 of them were teams that I thought a lot of going into the season. And South Alabama, they went on the road and had that great win against Oklahoma State, but then they followed up with a loss against Central Michigan. So they're kind of up and down. Troy hasn't started off great, but the talent's there. And I think that this is going to be a game they're going to get up for.
I could see it. And you talked about, teams that were the group of 5 representative for the New Year's Six. The selection I was looking at for this week is a team that was formerly a group of 5 power in Cincinnati, going on the road at BYU. Cincinnati this year, obviously not nearly the same team, and they're favored to beat BYU in Provo. And I think you've got to take BYU with this pick.
Wrong team favored, Joe. I'm a huge fan of BYU, especially if you can ever get them as a home underdog. That's a great spot, especially against a team like Cincinnati, who this year has done nothing. I mean, they lost a game against Oklahoma recently where they scored 6 points. They lost 20-6. They lost to somebody week 1 who wasn't very good. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was either a D2 school or a non-group of 5 team or a non-power 5 team. And they just haven't shown a whole lot to me. Meanwhile, BYU came out the gate slow on offense, but went down to Arkansas, beat them on the road with a huge comeback. They have a lot of confidence right now. And BYU, even though they got a fan base that doesn't drink and, you're not going to have the kind of experience you have when you go to an LSU game, I think it's one of the more intimidating atmospheres in all of college football. It kind of has a little bit of the Penn State feel when you look at all the white clothing pays against the mountains and the darkness and the loudness that you get at BYU. I think they have just an incredible home atmosphere. And there's no way that their very first Big 12 game when they take on a reeling Cincinnati team that they don't get this win.
Oh yeah, I mean their atmosphere for their athletics is just unbelievable. So underrated too. Their football is fantastic, and their basketball arena holds 24,000. It's always spectacular too.
Definitely, BYU's on my list of road trips I'd like to go. I mean, I know Ole Miss played them a few years ago. If there's another chance for me to see an Auburn or Ole Miss game taking on BYU in Provo, I definitely am going to try to do that.
Yeah, that'd be a fun trip.
Joe, moving on. I mean, this weekend we have the Deep South's oldest rivalry, and going into last week, I did think A&M was going to beat Auburn, but in the back of my mind, I thought if Auburn could somehow pull through and gut out this win, it's going to be a great atmosphere in Jordan-Hare Stadium for Georgia coming in. And we know that Georgia's got, he's not a freshman quarterback. He's a senior, but he's been sitting on the bench for a long time. Jordan-Hare Stadium at night, when they're taking on a really excellent football team and they've got a lot of belief in their team and doing well I'm a biased person here, but I think it's the best home environment in America. And if they could have won that game against A&M, I think that they would have had that going for them. I don't know that I would have picked the upset, but I would have thought it was possible. The problem I see now is I think there's still going to be a lot of Auburn fans going. If they could somehow get in the fourth quarter, it'll be a legit environment. But I just think that the way they lost that game last week and the awfulness that we saw at the quarterback position just makes it to where you can't really have any hope that Auburn can win this game because they're taking on the best defense in America, and you're taking on the best defense in America with what appears to be the worst quarterbacks in all of the conference. So, I hate to be the doom and gloom Auburn fan on this, but I think this is a game where if they can go out and they can score 17 points or more, I consider it as a moral victory. That makes me shake saying that. It's so awful, but I think it's true.
No, I think so. I think it's just, how close is the game really is kind of the barometer here. I think that I still have questions about Georgia's offense the rest of the way with their running game, with Carson Beck, throwing the ball consistently. But I don't think this is the game where that comes up. Unfortunately, I just don't see anything that I can trust about Auburn's offense.
No, and Joe, I think the defense can play with anybody. I think that it's certainly possible that they have the same kind of thing they had last week against A&M where they were losing, 6-3 at halftime. They could even be winning something like 7-6 at halftime. They have what may be the best secondary in America when you think about Pritchett, Zion Puckett, Jalen Simpson, who had interceptions in the first 3 games. There's a lot of talent there. Keon Lee, really good freshman corner. Keontae Scott, I mean, they're loaded at the secondary. Asante has proven to be maybe a first-team All-SEC player at the end of the season. Marcus Harris is a really good defensive lineman. I mean, they really got talent like on all three levels of defense. It's just when you switch over to the offense, yes, they have Jarquez Hunter, who's not getting fed the ball enough, who I still think is kind of rusty after all the personal trauma that he went through in the offseason, and then getting the suspension. And Rivaldo Fairweather is like a very athletic tight end. I think Shane Hooks is showing himself to be the strongest receiver they have, the transfer from Dion and Jackson State. But right now, you have a quarterback he's got decideophobia, Joe. He doesn't know who to throw it to. He holds on to the ball for too long. And you pair decideophobia with a weak offensive line, and that's a recipe for disaster.
No, it is. It is. I mean, like I said, it's once again just how close is the game going to be. I think that the only thing that lends itself for me to this game potentially being surprisingly crazy would be the fact, it's on the road at Auburn, like you were talking about with the atmosphere. And then I think also with the fact that there's just something about this Georgia team, their quest to three-peat, where as good as their defense is talent-wise, still just something about this team to me where I feel like they're just not the same that they were the last 2 years, in my opinion.
I'm with you, Joe. I still think they're going to drop a road game. Maybe Tennessee. I need to see what Tennessee can do, at having South Carolina there, and see if that home atmosphere can really rejuvenate that team. That might be the one that I think could be iffy for Georgia, but it's not going to be this one. And Joe, in that same vein, we just saw an Ole Miss team that had its best chance ever to beat Alabama, probably had a better team on paper. Everything was trending in their direction, and they laid an Easter bunny-sized egg in a really terrible performance on offense. Now they have an LSU team coming in who destroyed them in the last three quarters of the game last year, had a little bit of a shaky game last week, which I think is a negative for Ole Miss. That's going to make LSU even more hyper-focused this week. And Joe, I know it's at home for Ole Miss, but do you even think it's going to be that exciting of an atmosphere? I feel like last week was so devastating to Ole Miss that I'm just not sure, A, what kind of team is going to go out there, and B, what kind of home environment they're going to have.
I don't know. It's hard to say. It's kind of similar to Notre Dame, where it's the worst possible opponent to play after that laying that egg the way it was against Alabama. And we knew that coming into the season. Even if you won the game, it was horrible to have to play LSU, a game that so many Ole Miss fans care about the very next week. I mean, you're in the brunt of the schedule where you've got to play Alabama on the road, LSU at home, then you host Arkansas, who you always have problems with if you're Ole Miss. Mm-hmm. And then 2 weeks later, you're at Auburn. And so this is a very tricky schedule. And so it could really get out of hand if you don't win this game. And there's a lot of concern because I think that LSU poses a matchup nightmare for Ole Miss. I think that Jaden Daniels, what he can do with his legs, I think that that's a huge issue for Ole Miss. For LSU is also a matchup nightmare.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, we saw that Jalen Milroe was able to make some plays with his legs and, throw some touchdown passes when he was under pressure, like that really awesome one that he threw in the back of the end zone when he got tattooed. Jaden Daniels is not just a better quarterback than Jalen Milroe. He's a much better quarterback than Jalen Milroe. And we saw it last year. I mean, they had no answer for Jaden Daniels. They haven't seen a receiver that's anywhere near the caliber of Malik Neighbors or a tight end that's anywhere near as good as Mason Taylor. And Joe, I'm really worried that this is going to be a boat race game. I kind of feel like Ole Miss is going to come out very flat, uninspired. And I thought that performance last week is going to be devastating for them for maybe the rest of the season.
It really could be. And like I talked about in our earlier episode, I saw a lot of issues and deficiencies with the scheme of this Ole Miss offense, and I did not see anything that gives me a level of confidence in the passing game. Like, I know that Jackson Dart is a game.
Yeah, Joe, I mean,
live, but I think ultimately talked about the fact they lack the deep threat. They're struggling to run the football. And so basically, Dan, it seems like everything has to be kind of a slow, methodical drive. Got to wait. And you have to turn the.
Yeah, Joe, I agree. I mean, we saw it with Alabama last week that they seem like that, you're used to that hyper fast, hurry up kind of offense from Lane. I mean, even at the end of the game, they were down by 2 scores, and Lane was taking it down to the final 5 seconds to snap it every time. And it was causing like me and my wife to like freak out. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, we're down by 2 scores. Why are you taking forever to snap the ball? I mean, there was no urgency with the offense, and maybe that's by design based on the lack of playmakers.
Yeah, the offense just looks very different than it has, in other seasons, and also I think different than it did the first couple of weeks of the season, which is kind of odd. And yeah, it may be because of the lack of playmakers. You don't have the deep threat. And I also wonder, too, if maybe, he's decided that some of these opposing defenses are kind of figuring out, what he was doing the last couple of years.
It could be what it is, Joe. I'm not really sure. I mean, whatever it is, I don't know that it's a recipe for success. I think we saw that last week, and we're going to see it again against a very talented LSU defense. Joe, I talked about it that, you and I both think this Georgia team is not quite as good as what we saw the last couple of years. Despite what happened in Florida, I am not ready to write off Tennessee. As an Auburn fan that saw Auburn for 23 years in a row go down to Death Valley and lose every single time at LSU, and at least on 5 of those occasions, at least 5 out of those 10 trips down there to Death Valley, I thought Auburn had at least as good at, if not a better team than LSU, including one where Auburn blew a 20-point lead against LSU in 2017 when we made the SEC championship game with Jarrett Stidham. Auburn's football team was 20 points better than LSU in that game. LSU had just lost to Troy that season, and Auburn still found a way to lose in Baton Rouge. Sometimes there is something about a place that you go into, and there's some voodoo. There's something that gets in your mind. And obviously Tennessee, when they go out of the swamp, that's the place it is for them. Next time when Tennessee plays Florida, they'll have had the same amount of losses in a row that Auburn had in Baton Rouge. And so with that being the case, I'm not ready to write off this Tennessee team for going down and getting upset by Florida. They have a huge opportunity at home this week, and they're taking on South Carolina, who last year beat them like a drum and ended their college football playoff hopes, which, I was a huge fan of Tennessee last year. I thought for most of the season, they were the best team in America. And South Carolina, on the road, that's a tough environment, beat them pretty handily. And, of course, that's the game where Hendon Hooker got beat. Now you see Tennessee getting to host the Gamecocks at home. Huge opportunity for Tennessee to right the ship.
It really is. And you feel like if they win this game, everything is right in front of them. I don't think anybody thinks that Florida is going to be able to run the table, without a couple of losses in the SEC. So the opportunity is right there.
Yeah, Joe, I think that I have not given up on Tennessee or Joe Milton, and I think the home environment at Rocky Top, they're going to smell blood. They really want to get the revenge in this game. I don't know that I would feel comfortable laying the points on Tennessee. It's at 12.5, but I do think Tennessee gets the dub and sets themselves up for a chance to be able to host Georgia for what will probably be game day.
Yeah, because lastly, Florida's still going to play, LSU and Georgia. So there's probably 2 losses right there.
Absolutely. Speaking of losses, Joe, Florida has got to go to Kentucky this weekend, and it'll be the first time that Kentucky has been favored over Florida since 1988.
Wow, that's crazy.
Kentucky is a team, they've been quietly undefeated. Frankly, Joe, they haven't played anybody, so we don't really know what this Kentucky team is yet. They had one of the best transfer quarterbacks in all of America. Devin Leary came in out of NC State, really highly touted. I think they still have Chris Rodriguez at running back, and they don't have Kvassier Smoke anymore. I think he transferred somewhere. I can't remember. He may have transferred to Colorado, actually. But they have a lot of talent. This is a quiet team. You always feel like with Mark Stoops, it's like every other year they're good. Last year they were a disappointing team. This year could be that every other year. So this is a big opportunity for Kentucky at home. I know they wanted this game to be the night game because Lexington seems to have a good environment at nighttime, but I think it's going to be the early kick. What do you see in this one?
I think Kentucky's got a good chance to win. I think that probably a lot of Kentucky and Missouri fans are probably frustrated with the fact that, not as many people are talking about them in the SEC East. The focus is more on Tennessee, Georgia, even Florida. And I think, Kentucky is going to be vastly motivated. I think they've got a good chance to win this.
I think so too, Joe. I mean, I think we saw earlier this year that Florida is a team that does have some talent, plays hard, but is not a disciplined football team. And we saw that on the road when they took on Utah early this year. They made a lot of mistakes, sending two players out there with the same number. They didn't seem to communicate very well in a road environment, a lot of false starts. Kentucky is an underrated road atmosphere. A lot of teams have trouble there. I think Kentucky, on the strength of their home crowd and a slight advantage, I think, at quarterback, gets the W here over Florida.
I can see it. I think that's the difference, the quarterback play too, and the home crowd.
That's right, Joe. Speaking of home crowds, the Carrier Dome at Syracuse, not known to be the best, most raucous of home crowds, but for some reason, it's been a little bit of a house of horrors for Clemson. Even in a year where Clemson won the national championship, they went up to Syracuse, up to upstate New York, and they lost to the Orangemen. Clemson is coming off a really huge loss to Florida State, that kind of is destroyed any chance they had a national championship this season. Their ACC title hopes are on life support right now. Syracuse is quietly undefeated. And in the game of, what sounds like two dinosaurs playing each other in Dino and Dabo, I think that Syracuse has got a great chance to pull the home upset this weekend. That Syracuse, definitely has a really great opportunity to pull an upset this weekend.
I think they do. And you think about the atmosphere there. If they were playing basketball, which the basketball team plays in the Carrier Dome, you think of that being a great atmosphere. But for whatever reason, this has been a very tough venue for Clemson on the road. I think Syracuse got a great chance. And if they win the game, I think that it really could be a tailspin for Clemson the rest of the way.
Yeah, Joe, this is a real make it or break it game for Clemson, a put up or shut up game. I even think that when you look at two similar kind of quarterbacks, Syracuse has got the better playing kind of Will Levis type, where they're not very accurate, but they have a big arm and they run really well and tough, and Garrett Schrader. And Joe, I can't help but think when I see the success that Garrett Schrader has had this year, especially running the football, that if he'd had the foresight to know that this Mike Leach tragedy would have happened, if maybe he should have stayed at Mississippi State and Will Rogers could have gone to a place like Syracuse or something, because I feel like Garrett Schrader would be perfect in this new Mississippi State offense that's so focused on the run.
Yeah, he really would be. And I can't believe he still is playing. He's one of those guys that it seems like he's been in college for a while.
Yeah, he has been. He's been around for a long time. I mean, I feel like it was at least 3 years ago that he played for Mississippi State.
Yeah, exactly. He and Cavassier Smokes, another guy, I thought he had already finished.
Yeah, with this transfer portal, people are just kind of going all over the place.
Yep.
Joe, speaking of which, Texas is a team that made a lot of hay in the transfer market. They went out and got A.D. Mitchell from Georgia. You got some really talented players, some guys who were in Alabama. They're traveling to Kansas this week in an undefeated matchup of Big 12 teams. I think Kansas may be ranked. They may be ranked in the bottom 20s. Joe, let me just say this. Last week, I had my game that was the Texas is still overrated game. I thought Baylor would beat Texas straight up. I thought the Baylor road environment is always one that's tough. I mean, we saw it, with the way that I'm trying to think who it was that came down there and played them on the road. Utah had a lot of trouble beating Baylor down there, and Utah's got such a great football team. Texas, instead of dropping one that I would have thought to a very motivated in-state team on the road, they went out and put out what's probably their most impressive performance of the season. They win 38-6 on the same week that we saw Alabama's defense impose their will on Ole Miss. And Joe, I'm not saying I'm a believer. Don't put me in the Texas is going to win the national championship. I'm not putting that hat on, but I may be putting on their playoff team hat. And I think that Kansas is a great story. I like Lance Leipold. We were just talking about Mississippi State a second ago with Garrett Schrader, how he'd been better down there. I can't help think that if for some reason the Zach Arnett experiment doesn't work, I don't know that it's not. I'm just saying if it doesn't, the Lance Leipold, if I was Mississippi State, he would be the first one I would call, and I would not stop calling him because everything that Lance Leipold has done is he's gone to programs that don't have a history of a lot of success, and he gets the absolute most out of them. And if you could see what he did at Kansas, and he took Kansas from a team that was the laughing stock of America, maybe the worst group Power 5 team that it was in all of college football, and put him in a place where they've been ranked 2 years in a row and gotten out to consecutive, 4-5-0 starts. I mean, think what he could do in Starkville. I think I would offer that guy $10 million a year to be my head coach at Mississippi State.
It seems like that would be a really good fit. I had not considered that. I think that's a good point. And I think that, what he's done at Kansas, just unbelievable job. And 2 years in a row, like you said, just unbelievable. Yeah, I feel like, though, Texas will win this game because here where Kansas was kind of like the story, in September. This year, of course, it was Colorado. But you feel like this is kind of where it ends for Kansas as far as being undefeated. But for Texas, I still think, they have a good chance to probably drop a game at some point this season. But I feel like it's normally classic Texas when they drop a game that you kind of don't expect them to drop. And because this is a ranked opponent, I feel like they're probably a little bit more razor focused. I kind of look for them, if they lose a game this year, it's going to be a game where it's not one we're expecting them to lose.
That's what I think too, Joe. I mean, I think too many people are talking about the Lance Leipold and the Kansas story. Not Jaden Daniels, but Jalen Daniels, a quarterback, really excellent, also a very mobile quarterback for Kansas. That I think that Texas is going to be very focused for this game. They've shown that they're a very good road team. I mean, they went to Tuscaloosa, got a big W. They just went down to Waco and got a big W. I don't think the Kansas home environment is going to do a whole lot to this Texas team. And I just think the talent gap is just so much right now. When Kansas beat Texas 2 years ago, that was Sark's first season. He was still in the process of adding talent in, getting his system together. They're going 100 miles an hour right now. And I look for Texas to have a really good game offensively. I look for Quinn Ewers, Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, their slew of really excellent receivers just to have a heyday. And Joe, I kind of like Texas to win this one pretty big. I could see this being a 20-plus point margin of victory.
I could see it. I could see Ewers, performing really well and just really showcasing that offense in this game.
Absolutely. Joe, we just talked about Utah. They're a team that people are talking about, but they may be the most impressive team in America to me when you consider they've done everything without their starting quarterback, who's the heart and soul of this team, who's been missing for this entire season. They go out, they beat Florida really convincingly at home. They go down to Waco, Texas, get a big win. They take on high-flying UCLA and Dante Moore at quarterback, and they beat them 14-7. Joe, Cam Rising has risen. He's coming back this week, and they get to go on the road to Oregon State to take on an Oregon State team who lost a really hard-fought competitive Pac-2 championship game against Washington State last week. And, Joe, I think this is a good chance for Utah to say, listen, we're not just a great defense. When we have Cam Rising, we also have a next-level offense. I think they're also getting back their really strong tight end they have, who's probably a first-round talent. And I think this is going to be Utah's coming-out party in their real form as a complete team.
They've got a good opportunity here. I mean, it's going to be tricky Friday night on the road in the Pac-12 at Corvallis, a desperate Oregon State team. But at the same time, I mean, I think that you have a microcosm of Utah that reminds me a little bit of traces of like 2014 Ohio State, being able to pull this off with like a second or third string quarterback. I mean, they're winning it obviously different ways, but still, this team, I feel like they're really built to maybe make some noise the way this year is going.
Absolutely, Joe. I mean, I think the Utah has shown they have a defense that will make it hard for anyone in America to score on them, not just teams in the Pac-12. I mean, SEC, ACC, Big Ten, you name it. I don't think there's any team in America that'll put up more than 28 points against against Utah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Joe, speaking of Pac-12 in a game that'll probably put up a lot of points, let's look at talking about USC and Colorado. This game lost a little bit of glitz and glamour after the way that Colorado went out and got skull drugged by Oregon last week. But still, we got Shedeur Sanders, Caleb Williams taking on each other in Colorado. It's still going to be a good environment. Colorado got humbled a little bit. We all expected it to happen the first week of the season against TCU, but instead they won their first 3 games and were the toast of college football. Now's a real test of how great of a coach Deion is. We've seen what he can do with success. We've seen what he can do with branding, with getting his team's name out there. How do they respond to getting utterly whipped? I'm fascinated to see this.
Yeah, because there's a part of me that could see USC taking it to them, and it's 2, drubbings 2 weeks in a row. There's also a part of me that could see Sanders and Williams kind of exchanging scores maybe in the first half, and it's kind of toe-to-toe, back and forth, offensive fireworks. But I think kind of the way I see it happening is probably you'll see a scenario where Colorado will have some big plays, but I just don't see any way that Colorado will be able to keep up with the pace of USC. I think that there's too much of an opportunity with the lack of depth for Colorado with their defensive woes. I think that they'll be gassed at times defensively. And on the flip side, I just don't think their offense will quite be able to keep up.
That's kind of what I think too, Joe. I think this is a game where the over is really enticing. I think it's like 70. But I think that after the offensive woes that Colorado had last week, I think Shedeur and, all their talented playmakers they have, including Thorne, are going to have a big-time game. And I think they'll put up some points. But I also think that USC is going to get a couple turnovers with the pressure they get. Colorado doesn't have the best offensive line. Look for Bear Alexander, the Georgia transfer, to have a big impact. And meanwhile, they're not going to be able to do anything to stop Caleb Williams and all of his talented playmakers he has around him. I look for this game to be somewhere in the range of 48-31. I don't think it's going to be quite as embarrassing as what we saw with Oregon last week, but I still think USC wins pretty decidedly.
I think so. And lastly, I think the stat to look at is watch which quarterback throws it the most times with pass attempts. I guarantee almost that you'll see Sanders with over 50 pass attempts, and you'll see Caleb Williams probably with under 35. He'll be so much more efficient.
Absolutely. Let me just say this to all the teams in America that have a really great running back who isn't being utilized that much. Make sure you give him his carries and make sure he's happy because Deion's coming in the offseason. Their biggest problem right now is at running back, and he will get a stellar transfer running back.
That's true.
All right. Well, speaking of stellar, we enjoyed everybody listening to the Stellar Show. You can listen to all of our episodes on Spotify. Look up the Dan and Joe Sports Show on Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Dan and Joe Sports Show. And, of course, follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.